When most of us picture medieval kings and queens, we imagine sparkling palaces, towering castles, and rulers wrapped in soft ermine and rich velvet, covered from head to toe in expensive jewels. It looks like they spent every day surrounded by comfort, wealth, and luxury. But once I started digging beneath those shining crowns and all the grand ceremonies, I realized the truth was a whole lot darker. Behind all that royal pageantry was a world filled with secrets, suffering, and generations of choices that came with serious consequences. Europe's royal families spent centuries marrying within the same small circle of relatives, creating a tangled web of bloodlines that many of them probably hoped history would quietly forget. If those old royal record keepers had their way, plenty of these stories would have stayed locked away forever. Well, they're long gone now, which means nothing is stopping me from opening those dusty pages and finding out what really happened. So, let's take a journey into a world built from stone fortresses, complicated family trees, and dangerous ambition, a place where power often came at a terrible price. A dark cloud settled over the Spanish monarchy in October 1646, when King Philip IV of Spain received the devastating news that his only son and heir, 16-year-old Balthazar Charles, had died from smallpox. With the prince's death, the kingdom lost far more than a young life. It also lost the fragile hope of a royal bloodline that had already been weakened by years of heartbreak and tragedy. Just 2 years earlier, Philip had buried his wife, Elizabeth of France, and the royal court was still struggling to recover from that loss. Now the king was facing an even greater crisis. What haunted him wasn't just the grief of losing his son. It was the terrifying possibility that everything he had worked to preserve could begin to fall apart. The close alliance between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family had been essential to holding his empire together, and without a clear heir, that balance suddenly looked dangerously unstable. Philip knew he had very few options left. If the dynasty was going to survive, he needed to marry again. So, in 1649, at 44 years old, Philip IV took a new wife. His bride was 14-year-old Mariana of Habsburg, the same young woman who had originally been promised in marriage to his late son. Mariana was the daughter of Ferdinand III, the Holy Roman Emperor, and she also happened to be Philip's own niece. That marriage was another powerful reminder of just how tightly the Habsburg family had wrapped its bloodline around itself over the generations. 2 years after their wedding, the young queen gave birth to the first of their 5 children. Sadly, only 2 of those children would live past childhood. Then, in November 1661, Mariana finally delivered the long-awaited heir to the Spanish throne, the boy who would become Charles II of Spain. His birth should have been a moment of celebration for the entire kingdom. Instead, it carried a heavy sense of foreboding. When historians traced his family tree, they found something astonishing. Out of the 56 ancestors in Mariana's family line, 48 were also ancestors of Philip. The same names appeared over and over again, generation after generation. Congratulations, little Charles. You had just earned the unfortunate distinction of becoming the most inbred royal in European history. The Habsburg dynasty had succeeded in protecting what it believed was the purity of its bloodline, but it had done so at an enormous cost. Charles became the living proof of that decision, a fragile symbol of the dangerous legacy King Philip had fought so desperately to preserve. To understand how everything ended up going so terribly wrong, I have to go all the way back to where it started. Royal inbreeding wasn't something the medieval world invented. It had been happening for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, many rulers believed they weren't just kings and queens, they believed they were living gods. Because of that, marrying close relatives wasn't seen as strange. Pharaoh Ramesses II married one of his own daughters. Cleopatra III married her brother, and Amenhotep I married his sister. Keeping royal blood pure was considered more important than anything else. People were already trying to figure out how inheritance worked long before modern science existed. As early as the 5th century BC, Hippocrates had his own theory about genetics. He believed in something often described as the bricks and mortar theory. According to his idea, tiny physical elements from every part of a person's body became concentrated in semen. After conception, those pieces supposedly came back together inside the womb to build a new human being. Hippocrates also believed that physical traits someone developed during life could be passed down to their children. So, if a man had especially powerful leg muscles, Hippocrates thought he contained more leg muscle parts, making it more likely that his son would also be born with stronger legs. Aristotle wasn't convinced. He challenged that idea by asking a simple question. If someone became disabled or physically deformed later in life, why could that person still have a perfectly healthy child? To Aristotle, that didn't fit Hippocrates' explanation at all. Instead, Aristotle believed parents passed along information rather than actual physical pieces of their bodies. He thought inherited traits worked more like a blueprint that guided how a child developed. He even argued that characteristics which didn't show up until later in life, like courage or boldness, could still be inherited from one's parents. One idea from Aristotle, though, became especially important for royal families. He emphasized the importance of blood in heredity, and monarchs across Europe embraced that belief with almost obsessive dedication. They guarded their bloodlines fiercely, convinced that keeping royal blood as pure as possible was the key to preserving their power. Today, of course, we understand heredity very differently. We know that DNA carries our genes. Every human being has 46 chromosomes, with 23 inherited from each parent. Together, they form the genetic instructions that influence everything from our hair color and blood type to many aspects of our physical development and even certain inherited abilities. The real danger appears when a child inherits a defective gene. That risk becomes much greater if both parents carry the same harmful gene and pass it on, something that's far more likely when the parents belong to the same family line. The more closely related two parents are, and the more often those close family marriages happen generation after generation, the greater the chance that harmful genetic traits keep building up. Over time, that dramatically increases the likelihood that children will be born with multiple inherited disorders. Even first cousins face noticeably higher risks. Compared to unrelated parents, their children have roughly twice the chance of dying during infancy or being born with certain physical or intellectual disorders. The future of an entire dynasty often rested on the birth of a single child. Because of that, royal couples lived under constant pressure, but the queen usually carried the heaviest burden. If she failed to produce a son, she was almost always the one blamed. In a world where many powerful men were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a woman ruling, a male heir was seen as the only way to protect the monarchy and keep the kingdom stable. For most medieval kings, nothing mattered more than fathering a son. Just look at Henry VIII of England. He divorced his first two wives because neither gave him the male heir he desperately wanted. To end his 24-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he completely reshaped England's religious landscape by breaking away from the Catholic Church. Then his second wife, Anne Boleyn, was executed after being accused of adultery and, even more controversially, witchcraft. Throughout medieval Europe, royal families formed a tightly connected network where power was passed through bloodlines. The easiest way to preserve that power was for one member of a royal house to marry another. Choosing a queen for a king or a bride for a prince was rarely about love. Almost every marriage was arranged to strengthen political alliances, expand influence, or secure territory. And, in the minds of many rulers, the purer the royal bloodline remained, the better. No family embraced that belief more completely than the Habsburgs. Also known as the House of Austria, the Habsburg Dynasty became one of the most influential royal families in European history. Over time, the family divided into two powerful branches, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. Even though they ruled separate realms, both sides remained committed to the same goal: keeping power locked inside their own family. The Austrian branch stood at the center of the dynasty. For generations, its members wore the crown of the Holy Roman Empire and governed a vast empire that survived all the way into the 20th century. The Spanish branch began with a marriage that changed European history. In 1496, Philip I, better known as Philip the Handsome and the son of Emperor Maximilian I, traveled to Spain to marry Joanna of Castile. That wedding did much more than unite two royal houses. It created a new Habsburg line whose influence would soon stretch from the heart of Europe across Spain's growing overseas empire. As the years passed, the family's marriage strategy became increasingly focused inward. Marriages between uncles and nieces, first cousins, and other close relatives slowly became almost routine. Between 1450 and 1750, the Holy Roman Emperors and the Spanish Habsburg kings arranged 73 marriages involving themselves, their children, and their grandchildren. What started as a network of political alliances gradually tightened into an incredibly tangled family web. Many of those marriages involved close blood relatives. 4 different times, an uncle married his own niece. Those unions included Philip II of Spain with Anna of Habsburg, Archduke Charles with Marie of Bavaria, Philip IV with Mariana of Habsburg, and Leopold I with Margaret of Spain. The pattern didn't stop there. There were 2 marriages between double first cousins, 9 between first cousins, 4 between first cousins once removed, 1 marriage between quadruple second cousins, 7 between second cousins, and many more involving relatives who were still unmistakably connected by blood, even if the relationship was more distant. When historians looked at all 73 marriages, they found that only 24, less than 1/3, were between couples who were less closely related than second cousins. The consequences were devastating. Generations of inbreeding didn't just increase infant and childhood mortality, it also led to a growing number of inherited physical and mental disorders throughout the dynasty. One of the most recognizable features became known as the Habsburg jaw, a medical condition called mandibular prognathism. It caused the lower jaw to extend noticeably forward, creating the distinctive appearance seen in many Habsburg portraits. The condition also frequently resulted in malocclusion, meaning the upper and lower teeth no longer lined up properly, leaving the bite visibly misaligned. Many members of the family also suffered from hydrocephalus and epilepsy. Hydrocephalus, often called water on the brain, occurs when excess fluid builds up inside the brain, creating pressure that can damage surrounding tissue and interfere with normal brain function. One striking example was Ferdinand I, who became Emperor of Austria in 1835. His parents were double first cousins, and Ferdinand inherited several serious medical conditions, including the characteristic Habsburg jaw, hydrocephalus, and epilepsy. Even though he reportedly suffered as many as 20 seizures in a single day, he still remained emperor for 13 years. Because he was unable to consummate his marriage, he never had children. Leopold I, who ruled as Holy Roman Emperor beginning in 1658, also displayed the famous Habsburg jaw. He was short, thin, and struggled with poor health throughout his life. The dynasty's weakened immune system left many family members especially vulnerable to infectious diseases. Even so, Leopold ruled for nearly 47 years, making him the second longest reigning Holy Roman Emperor in history. Incest had become far more than an occasional political strategy. It had evolved into the defining pattern that shaped the Habsburg dynasty for centuries, leaving behind a legacy that would eventually help bring one of Europe's greatest royal families to the edge of collapse. If there was ever a single person who showed just how devastating generations of Habsburg inbreeding had become, it was Charles II of Spain. When Charles was born in 1661, the damage caused by centuries of marriages between close relatives had reached its breaking point. He inherited the Spanish crown before he was even 4 years old, but from the very beginning, his health was incredibly fragile. He suffered from rickets, and until he was about 6 years old, he couldn't even walk without someone supporting him. It seemed like he was constantly battling one illness after another. Fevers and rashes came and went throughout his childhood, and diseases like smallpox, measles, rubella, and chickenpox left him in a nearly endless cycle of sickness. Charles also had an unusually enlarged tongue, and his famous Habsburg jaw was so severely misshapen that he didn't speak his first words until he was 8 years old. Even eating became a daily struggle. Because he couldn't chew properly, he often swallowed food whole, only to vomit it back up moments later. As he entered his teenage years, epileptic seizures added yet another challenge to his already failing health. His mental development progressed much more slowly than that of other children, and he became known for sudden explosive outbursts along with an almost constant craving for chocolate. Now, before anyone starts worrying, I'd say you're probably safe if you happen to love chocolate too, unless that craving is completely impossible to resist. As unbelievable as it seemed, Charles continued to survive despite doctors having little idea how he managed to stay alive. He lived until just before his 40th birthday, when his condition deteriorated so badly that he eventually became unable to eat. Since he never had any children, Charles named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France, as his successor. When Charles II died in November 1700, the findings from his autopsy painted a shocking picture of just how severely his body had deteriorated. According to the report, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were badly damaged, his intestines were rotten and gangrenous, he had only one testicle, described as black as coal, and his skull contained an abnormal buildup of fluid. With Charles's death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg Dynasty came to an end. So why did the Spanish Habsburgs disappear while the Austrian branch survived? The biggest reason was the long-term impact of inbreeding. In both branches of the family, marriages between close relatives dramatically increased infant and child mortality. Fewer children survived to adulthood, leaving fewer healthy heirs and placing the future of the dynasty at constant risk. King Philip IV of Spain first married his close relative Elizabeth of Bourbon when he was 10 years old and she was 13. Together they experienced 10 pregnancies, but only 2 of their children lived long enough to reach adulthood. After their son and heir, Balthazar Charles, died of smallpox as a teenager, Philip desperately needed another successor. That led him to marry his own niece, Mariana of Habsburg. Their marriage produced 5 children, but only 2 survived childhood. The surviving son, Charles II, inherited severe physical and intellectual disabilities and was never able to produce an heir, bringing the Spanish Habsburg line to its final end. The Austrian branch followed a similar path at first, but then something changed. Leopold I also married his niece, and of their 4 children, only 1 daughter survived. After her death, he married another close relative, yet all 3 of their children died young as well. On his 3rd marriage, however, Leopold made a different choice. This time, he married a much more distantly related woman. They had 10 children together, and 7 survived into adulthood. 2 of those sons would eventually become Holy Roman Emperors. While Philip IV's marriages became increasingly close in terms of blood relationship, Leopold's moved in the opposite direction, with each marriage involving a more distant relative. That difference likely helped preserve the Austrian Habsburg dynasty while the Spanish branch gradually collapsed under the weight of generations of inbreeding. And that's the story of how one of the most powerful royal families in European history slowly undermined itself, not through war, rebellion, or foreign invasion, but through centuries of trying to preserve the very bloodline they believed would keep them strong. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. If you enjoyed this episode of Medieval Madness, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like, dropped a comment, and subscribed to the channel. Every bit of support helps more than you probably realize. If you'd like to go one step further, you can also join our Patreon or become a YouTube member. For just £3 a month, you'll get an exclusive extra video every month. And if you join the higher £9 tier, you'll become one of the amazing supporters whose names appear on screen, permanently becoming part of this video's history for as long as the internet, or at least this channel, continues to exist. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I truly appreciate you being here, and as always, I'll see you next week with another video.